You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hi there, welcome to News Talks, the Times Higher Education podcast in which we discuss the biggest stories in global higher ed. I'm Miranda Prynne, and joining me today for his second foray onto News Talks is Times Higher Education features editor Paul Jump. Hi Paul, I'm glad your first experience of being quizzed by me on News Talks didn't send you running for the hills at the mention of another appearance.
Yeah, no, I survived that one. This one's a tougher ask, though, because there's about 20,000 words worth of write-up here to discuss, so hopefully my head doesn't explode.
No, and you know, that's the benefit for the listeners, that we are going to summarise it in beautiful terms. As you said, there is a very good reason for having you on this week's show, and that is that you have become our resident expert in recent weeks on the impact of the tens of thousands of job cuts seen across UK higher education in the last couple of years. And when I say impact, I mean the human impact. And this is off the back of a survey you carried out in February to March this year, the results of which you have been wading through these last few weeks and have now written up into two long but very affecting features, which really are well worth reading for anyone who's not yet done so. But before we get into the details of the findings, I think you're best placed to explain, what did this survey set out to discover?
Well, more than anything, it set out to give a human face to some of the statistics that, well, we report on a lot, as do lots of others. You know, I mean, there is a kind of vein of reporting that treats the redundancies and what have you as a bit of a numbers game. And obviously that's worth covering. We need to know how many people are being made redundant and all the rest of it. But I think it's definitely worth keeping in mind, particularly as journalists, that, you know, there's always a human story behind each of those figures. So although, you know, the survey is asking people a specific series of questions with multiple choice answers, so we do get numbers out of this survey as well. But I think primarily for me, what I was interested in was the comments that come along with those answers, and we got hundreds and hundreds of those. It was really getting to the coalface and, you know, finding out exactly how the redundancies are affecting things like morale, workload, sense of how effective management is, that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah, and we will come on to find out more about that very human side and what comments have been made. But just sticking with the statistics, in broad terms, how many people have lost their jobs in UK higher ed in the last couple of years?
Well, obviously there's more every day, and I think, you know, whatever number we give will be a bit of a lagging indicator. You know, obviously, not least this week, we've had hundreds announced, but at the last count we did, our resident expert in university's annual accounts, who isn't me, I'm happy to say, did a look at it earlier this year, and he found that in 2024-25, that was the most recent year for which, you know, the accounts have been published, there were about 13,000 people were made redundant that year, which, when you add it to the previous couple of years, adds up to about 30,000 since 2022. So, yeah, it's a lot, but it's worth bearing in mind that 30,000 is only about 6% of the 500,000 people that are employed by UK universities. So, you know, it's certainly a very big upheaval, and one that we haven't had the likes of in decades, really, but it's 6%, it's not 60%.
No, although 6% of people losing their jobs from any sector would rightfully be considered a very large loss. And so we know it stands to reason that there is huge anger and worry across the sector as a result of these job cuts. But what really struck you the most from the responses?
Well, as I say, it wasn't so much the numbers that struck me. I mean, I think the numbers are much what you'd expect. I think what's really struck me was just the strength of feeling about things. So it's not exactly how people felt that surprised me. It was just the sheer strength of feeling with which they felt it. Really, it's the negativity that particularly stands out. Negativity about people's own sense of morale, about where the sector's going, about how their own management is functioning. Particularly managers really do get quite a kicking in the comments. Yeah, I think that's what stays with me. I mean, I think it's probably important caveat perhaps to put in at this point that the respondents were self-selecting. We didn't seek a scientific cross-section of the sector or anything like that. So although we got a lot of respondents, 1,100 is quite a lot by a THE survey standard. They aren't necessarily representative, and obviously self-selecting people will self-select for surveys which they have strong opinions on. So it seems intuitively likely that the people who responded to our survey were more likely to be people who've been directly affected by redundancy or who feel very strongly about it. So this is probably a bit of selection bias there, but nevertheless, the pointedness of some of the comments was very striking.
Yes, and you talk about selectiveness, but from reading your write-ups of these survey results, what is clear is that a vast number of the responses, in fact, the great majority, are people who haven't actually been made redundant, but they still appear to feel as strongly.
Yeah, I think you're right that everybody feels strongly. Of the respondents, about 18% had been made redundant themselves. So it's obviously disproportionate compared to the sector as a whole, but it's by no means the majority in the survey. And even of those, they felt strongly. I mean, that's probably because a lot of them have, although even if they haven't been made redundant themselves, they have had some fairly direct experience of it. For example, 68% had seen someone in their department or division depart in the last couple of years as part of a redundancy round. So, that's more than 2/3, even more than that, nearly 75% had said some of their colleagues' jobs have been put at risk during that period, i.e. formally put at risk. And 38% of those who hadn't been made redundant themselves had had their jobs put at risk. So, even if they haven't been made redundant themselves, it's clear that a lot of this is very close to home for a lot of people, but by far the majority of people.
Yes. Were there any big surprises among the responses? What came out of it?
I don't know about surprises really, but again, I think it's the dimensions of the opinions and the differences that strikes you. I mean, it's unsurprising to me that senior managers feel quite differently about a lot of things from what professional staff do, and particularly what academics do. I mean, we know there's always been a bit of a tension between managers and academics, certainly in recent years. But nevertheless, the sort of huge differences that there are between their views is quite striking. I mean, one good example is that 77% of senior managers think that redundancies at their university were unavoidable, right? 77%, so more than 3/4. If you look at the respondents overall, which includes the senior managers, it still drops down to only 35%. And it's only 21% among arts and humanities academics. So there's huge disparities in perception really about whether this was necessary and the extent to which it was necessary.
Yes, perhaps the biggest surprise is the fact that so much of what people have said and warned has turned out via these results certainly to be not an exaggeration. You've done a lot of surveys in the past for THE on related topics such as work-life balance. How does this one compare?
I mean, in terms of numbers, it's pretty much the most we've got. We did get slightly more on a survey we did in 2022 about work-life balance, which got just under 1,200, so a very similar number, really. I guess that covered similar topics in a way, basically how people feel about their day-to-day lives and their morale and their workload and things. So that's clearly what people feel most strongly about, because obviously that's something that affects everybody. By comparison, we did a survey on academic freedom in 2024, which is obviously considered a very hot button issue especially in UK higher education, with all the legal shenanigans that's going on about it. But that one got 452 responses, so less than half of what this one got. And we did a digital teaching survey in 2020. Obviously, that was picking up on the digital switch that happened during COVID. So again, something that you might think affected pretty much everybody. But again, we only got 520 responses to that. So yeah, this one is definitely a very big one. And I think particularly in the terms of the number of comments we got, it's not just that 1,100 people answered the survey and just gave us quick, multiple choice answers in 5 minutes. It's clear that a lot of them took quite a lot of time to explain, exactly what was going on and how they felt about it, how bad they felt about it in most cases.
And I guess that's representative of what you've already mentioned, that strength of feeling, the fact that you did get big numbers and so many people who were not just answering it, but really answering it very comprehensively. Right, let's get into some of the detail. Where did your survey suggest the cuts themselves have actually fallen the hardest?
This is an interesting one, actually, because I suppose if you're asking about surprises, this is maybe one. And I think it's also maybe one that does perhaps raise a bit of a flag about how representative it is. But if you listen anecdotally, and indeed you look at the numbers, it's clear that across the sector, arts and humanities has been hit the hardest, not least this week or the last couple of weeks, with places like Hertfordshire announcing that they're cutting all of theirs. But when we asked whether you'd been made redundant or not, the most likely to say yes, funnily enough, were senior managers, which definitely wasn't expecting. And it's also true that professional staff were more likely to have been made redundant than academics, which again is perhaps not something that we always hear about. Even within academia, arts and humanities were less likely to have been made redundant than people in science and engineering, interestingly. So I'm not sure what was going on with the sample there. It seems a bit weird, but it's certainly worth keeping in mind, I suppose, that, although the popular perception which comes out from the comments is that managers have all got away scot-free and none of them have, even had to take a pay cut, never mind leave their jobs, it's evident from the responses that actually lots of them have.
Yes, I mean, it demonstrates that the cuts essentially have fallen across the board, of course, in some places more than others. And you're right. I mean, this is a small sample, so can't be taken as representative of what has happened across the sector. But it does give a kind of interesting twist on the accepted wisdom on that. The official narrative from sector leaders is that these redundancies are due to external pressures well beyond universities' control. For instance, falling per capita domestic student income, falling international student numbers, inflation, rising costs, all of which they would lay at the door of government policy and global economics and so on. But your survey respondents seem to challenge this narrative in terms of where the responsibility for the sector's financial woes lies. Can you talk us through who and what come under the most suspicion as being the cause of these job cuts?
It's a slightly complicated answer because we asked the questions in a slightly complicated way. We asked, for example, whether people thought the cuts had been avoidable or not, which was obviously going to inform which kind of answer you give. Interestingly, 35% of respondents did think that the cuts have been unavoidable. And as I mentioned, I think earlier, it goes up to 77% among senior managers. So that was the sort of preliminary question there. So among those who thought the cuts were unavoidable, the reasons they gave, it's fairly close between managerial failure, which was the top answer, with 32%. Close on its heels was the government's clampdown on international visas, which got 30%. So a definite mixture there of internal and external factors. And then not far behind that, 26% was the failure for student domestic funding to keep pace with costs. So those answers were specifically related to respondents' own institutions. When we asked about the sector as a whole, the reason for redundancies across the sector as a whole, it was fairly similar answers, but managerial failure dropped a bit, interestingly. It was the domestic funding issue that across the sector as a whole people thought had made the biggest difference. And then those that thought the redundancies had been avoidable, obviously they gave slightly different answers. The most popular answer there was fear of the financial future, really. So just the sense that managers were panicking about what was coming down the line, perhaps looking at other institutions and fearing that that could be them next. The more positive answer was that we offered was to pursue a new vision for the university or department. And that got 21%, so not insignificant, but a lot less than the 43% that thought it was all about fear. 12% thought that it was to target certain courses for closure. 7% thought it was to remove awkward colleagues. And 6% thought it was to remove underperforming colleagues. So, yeah, the reasons there are a bit more negative.
Yes, and there is definitely an acknowledgement there that there are major external factors that are proving hugely challenging for the sector. But I feel managerial mismanagement or managerial failure definitely got quite a lot of attention in terms of what lay behind these massive job cuts. Were there any comments to accompany the statistics that provide any insights or indeed might offer some lessons for university senior management in terms of their staff's attitudes and what perhaps they might have done better?
There certainly are. There's hundreds of them. And I think they pretty much all illustrate that in most cases, management just aren't really trusted to have the staff's best interests at heart. I think that's really what comes through. And I think that comes through in the question about whether the cuts were unavoidable or not. Lots of people thought that they were avoidable and that, managers had done it anyway. In terms of examples of comments, a psychologist said that her university's leadership, and I quote here, does not care about staff and our futures, our livelihoods, or our careers. And I'm certain that they will throw more of us under the bus if they get half a chance. Yeah, that's one of the more colourful comments, but it's by no means unrepresentative of the whole. A marketing and recruitment professional, so not an academic, this is from the other side of the divide, was complaining about increased workloads and, again, I quote here, a complete lack of support or meaningful recognition from senior management, with our VC taking a huge pay increase while we were asked to accept a paltry cost of living rise delayed by nearly a year. And that respondent concluded that all of this resulted in a tinderbox scenario.
So clearly there's a communications issue there. Staff do not think that their senior management care about them. But on a practical level, what do people think the management have done wrong to get them into this financial quagmire? I mean, you've referenced VC pay there.
There's a mixture of answers. One is a perception of incompetence. That's certainly frequently voiced. Lots of people talk about shiny buildings and money wasted on those. Generally, state projects, buying campuses overseas that they then had to close, that kind of thing. But yeah, people do talk about senior management pay as well. But yeah, I think there's a certain sense of slightly incompetent misadventure on the part of managers, basically taking on projects, taking on debt, for example, that ultimately proved unsustainable.
Coming back to the redundancies themselves, those who have remained in their jobs, what did they say about their working life since these cuts have fallen?
Not good things. I mean, one thing is that a lot of them fear for their own jobs, even if they've avoided being made redundant so far, a lot of them, a lot of them aren't confident that they will escape the chop the next time. If you look at it on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is feel strongly or agree strongly with the question, when you ask them whether they fear losing their job, you get an overall answer of 3.56. So it's pretty high, and it's particularly high among academics. And then if you ask them whether their departmental colleagues are fearful, you get an even higher answer. You get 4.25 there overall. 5 would be everybody strongly agreeing that was true. So in a survey like this, you rarely get numbers like that. You get typically people agree or disagree, but not particularly strongly. The minority agree strongly or disagree strongly. But in this case, by far the majority are agreeing strongly that they fear for their jobs. So yeah, I think one of the comments talked about fear stalking the halls of the department or something like that. But yeah, you definitely get that sense from both the numbers and the comments. And then a slightly more abstract question, I suppose, was whether what's happened has damaged morale. Obviously, fear of losing your job kind of feeds into that. This is assuming that redundancies have occurred. Okay, so this isn't everybody who answered the survey, but most of them, as we discussed earlier, have seen redundancies occur. And of those asked whether it's damaged their morale, you get a 4.46 out of 5. So, this is really in the realms of statistical freak almost, that people are so strongly agreeing that it has. And even among senior management, you get a 3.83 figure. So that's, again, it's pretty high. It's highest among academics. Even higher still, when you ask whether it's damaged morale in the department generally, so even if people themselves as individuals are feeling okay, when you ask about their colleagues, you get 4.66 as an answer in terms of agreeing that their colleagues' morale has been damaged. So it's pretty overwhelming. And then obviously another aspect of morale is workload. And again, comment after comment talks about how much the redundancies, the loss of colleagues has impacted on the workloads of those that remain. 4.46 is the figure for agreeing that the redundancies have resulted in an increase in people's own workloads. And again, perhaps it's worth saying that senior managers have also been affected by that. 4.17 is the figure for them. So senior managers have also felt that they've had to work harder as a result of colleagues lost. Got a couple of comments for you on this, if you like.
Yeah, far away.
Politics academic said he keeps trying to be positive, but it's exhausting. I moved my whole family here for the job. The guilt is horrendous. The stress is overwhelming. And then a historian said, seeing colleagues in despair crying at their desk, as well as talking about suicide in meetings, was a particular low point. So you can see why those agreement figures were so high when you read comments like this.
Yes, I have to say it does paint a pretty desperate picture of the working environment that people are existing in at the moment. And it also is worth saying that you did do a work-life balance survey back in 2022. And, people were really struggling then with the amount of work that they had. And of course, making cuts is going to have made that even more acute. So you can see how this results in a very, very, very troubling situation. And inevitably, I imagine that's likely to have a knock-on effect, of course, on the service being provided or the education being provided for students. Did anyone allude to that and concerns over that?
Yeah, they did. That was another specific question that we asked, what effect all this had on the student experience. And yeah, again, agreement was very high that it had affected it negatively, of course. 4.34 was the number there, agreeing with that. And again, even senior managers pretty strongly agreed, 3.45. And I think what comes through in a lot of the comments is that this is despite academics and indeed professional staff's best efforts. A lot of them talk about how hard they've tried to sort of plug the gaps by working harder and working smarter and all the rest of it. But I think the general conclusion is that it's becoming impossible really to cover the cracks at this point. One science department is apparently now at its bare bones, according to one of the respondents, and that respondent said that their pro-vice chancellor was using the term minimal viable product as the goal for their teaching now. So in other words, they're just trying to get away with it because they just realised that the kind of teaching that they used to do just isn't really possible on current staffing levels. Another respondent said they were exhausted by Tuesday. So they said students can't get the best of me, not surprisingly. And a scientist said that they and their colleagues were trying their best to shield their students, but there are direct consequences in terms of having to pull back to offering what we can get away with rather than what we want to deliver. So that was really very much the tone of pretty much all the responses to that question.
It is fairly heartbreaking to read because actually, as people say in the survey, they are working as best they can, and I don't doubt that because academia and higher education is on the by and large a fairly vocational career to enter, and people do it for the love of it. So many, if not all, will be willing to go above and beyond, but that can only go so far. I'm interested though, because as you said, this is self-selecting, and while it paints a picture that no one could not be affected by, I mean, it's incredibly sad what we're hearing from people. But you're having conversations daily with people in higher education, as well as editing hundreds of opinion and analysis pieces by sector experts each year. Do the worries, the accusations and claims in this survey seem fair and representative to you, or do you think the respondents have been somewhat prone to a bit of hyperbole or perhaps prejudice given the emotive nature of the topic and how people have been personally affected?
It's a good question. I mean, I certainly don't doubt the sincerity of the responses. I think people are very much sort of speaking their own truth, as it were, and have no motivation not to do so. I think the question about how representative it is probably a more pointed one. It's clear that the people in our survey have been more directly affected by redundancies than people in the sector as a whole, when you look at it statistically. And that's not a surprise. So I think this is clearly how a certain portion of academia is feeling. How representative it is of the whole, I just think it's very difficult to say from a survey like this. I think, you would need to get a professional polling organization to come up with a representative sample to really get at that. But it's, as I say, I do think that the pain is very real, clearly, from the people who've taken a lot of trouble to respond to our survey. And not only in the comments as well. I mean, it's also worth saying that the two articles that we've just published last week and a couple of weeks previously got a very big response as well on social media and in terms of readership and stuff. So it's clear that there is also a huge audience for this piece, and it's evidently ringing true with lots of people, because that's, again, what the comments are saying in social media and what have you.
And the picture it paints is dire. It is of a
Yeah.
sector that is fragmented, demoralised, overworked, stressed, angry, scared. I hate to say it, but it's quite hard to find anything among this stuff really to be optimistic about. Were you able to find any seeds of hope or optimism among the
Yeah, a
kind of
few glimmers.
misery? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that some of the people who have been made redundant have ended up landing on their feet. They've either got new jobs in academia or elsewhere, and in some cases they do profess to be happier than they were in their previous job. In some cases, much happier. A linguistics academic, for example, was very happy that she can finally do full-time research without teaching or administrative load. She said her old job had all three, but she was at 110% in her workload. Not sure how statistically possible that is, but clearly she was working very hard, and now she's a lot happier. Some of the older people that have taken voluntary redundancy, unsurprisingly, have taken early retirement, basically. They're just not looking for another job. And again, quite a few of those are very happy and asking themselves why they didn't do it earlier. It's slightly more twisted grain of comfort was the fact that some people were quite pleased to see some of their underperforming colleagues weeded out, who felt that were genuinely underperforming, and that the department was still functioning actually quite well without them, because they hadn't been really pulling their weight anyway. So there are a few people that see a few grains of comfort in it, but they're very few and far between, to be honest.
So not complete blanket negativity across the board, but not too far off. Still, it is very good to hear actually that there is a proportion of people that have gone on to find jobs where they are feeling happy, fulfilled, and indeed probably do have a better work-life balance.
Perhaps it's also worth saying, actually, before we move on, I mean, just picking up on what you were saying about people having a vocation for academia earlier, you could perhaps also see this as a bit of a grain of comfort, in that despite the shattered morale and all the rest of it, when we asked, for example, we asked unemployed respondents whether they'd prefer to find a new job in the university sector as opposed to another sector, for example. 44% agreed that they did want to do that, and only 29% disagreed. So definitely the balance of opinion of those who've been laid off is that they would prefer to remain in the academy rather than move to a different sector. So that's maybe quite surprising, but I guess shows you that, but however bad it gets, people still feel, a level of fulfillment in academia that they wouldn't necessarily get elsewhere. And also along those lines, we asked people whether they'd take voluntary redundancy if it were offered to them. This is obviously people that haven't already taken it. Only 19% said they would, and quite a few of those mentioned in comments that they only would if they felt that the alternative would probably be compulsory redundancy on worse terms. So for all the dislike of what's going on, it appears that people are not willingly rushing to the exit. They are obviously, lots of them are being pushed to the exit, but they're not rushing there themselves.
That's interesting. Yeah, people do still want to work in higher education. And I assume that was reflected also in those who are still working in higher education, that you said they wouldn't want to take voluntary redundancy, but that indicates they want to stay in the sector and keep working in the sector, regardless of, as you say, how they feel about this recent huge upheaval, which I don't think anyone could expect was going
Yeah.
to be welcomed. You have been immersed in this for the past few weeks, and I just wondered, from what you've learnt and read, how do you feel UK higher education might move forward from here to just even start the rebuilding process?
Well, in terms of rebuilding, obviously that is very dependent on sector finances and all the rest of it that is beyond everybody's control, which takes us back to that earlier question about the reasons for it. So I think to some extent the remedy is not within the gift of the sector. But what does strike you, I think, is the sense that the reason that the mistrust of management is so high, it seems to be, in part at least, related to a sense that the communication over redundancies has been very poor. People typically say that, a robust case wasn't really made for why the redundancies were necessary, and counter proposals from, the unions and others for avoiding the redundancies were just brushed aside without an adequate explanation of why that was. And there was a sense, I think, that these things were just being bulldozed through for whatever reason. So in terms of improving morale within the sector, I think there may be a message there for managers about being a bit more transparent about why exactly the cuts were necessary. I guess perhaps from commercial confidentiality issues there, I don't know, but it does strike me that certainly within an institution, I don't see why you couldn't share more of that and make more of a case, particularly to people like university workers that obviously, do have quite a robust relationship with facts and reasons and what have you, and are used to interrogating these things. So there's obviously a natural skepticism within the workforce that's always going to be there, and I think a smart manager probably works with that and rather than against it. There's a sense, I think, as well, that the pain isn't really being shared across the sector, and particularly at senior management level. There's a sense that failures are rewarded and, all the rest of it. And it would be a bold proposal from me to say that senior managers should take symbolic pay cuts. It's obviously not for me to say that, but it does strike me from reading the comments that kind of gesture might go quite a long way in terms of taking some of the edge off, the rank and file's sense of betrayal, really.
Yes, and that would give a sense of shouldering a shared responsibility. What you've described there really is kind of communications 101, or I don't know, leadership 101, if leading through a period of change. I think almost any senior manager listening to this could probably extract some lessons there in terms of, however hard what you're doing is, transparency and sharing your reasoning and all of that is incredibly important if you're going to carry people with you through a very difficult period, which is bound to be. I think we're all hoping that things get slightly easier. I have to say things aren't looking great, as you say, with this week further job cuts announced at the University of Nottingham and others. But perhaps we can hope that the next 12 months, next 24 months might bring a bit more stability at least. Time will tell. Thank you, Paul, for coming on and talking us through this extremely dense data set that you have pulled together.
Thank you.
And I'm sure we will have you back on soon. For everyone listening, that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do share, like, or subscribe, and we will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.